Dusty Rhodes is an egg-sucking dog. My eye! My eye! Terry, 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 Terry. There will never be another Terry Funk. No matter how hard anybody tries, no matter how hard anybody wrestles, no matter how long anybody wrestles, Terry Funk truly one of a kind. One of the greatest of all time. And what a life, what a career. Hard to encapsulate, impossible to duplicate. Let's talk about some of the moments that took place during his career and life. I'm John Rhythm with my tribute to Terry Funk, Part 1. Part 1 because I didn't even realize until I started writing down notes and writing down some of my favorite moments and everything that I wasn't even going to be able to scratch the surface in one video. I won't even be able to scratch the surface in 2 videos. But I'll leave it at 2, and also I don't want to go way too long, and also I want to know your favorite Terry Funk moments, matches, everything in the comments. But the promos, the matches, the moments, the fact that he wrestled from 1965 to 2017. Even though, yes, later in his career and life, he slowed down and he did, sporadic appearances, still, the fact that he covered 5 fucking decades. He covered the latter half of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2000s. Okay, 6. 6 decades. 6. And had appearances in Hollywood. So influential. Hardcore before there was hardcore. Made hardcore viable. I mean, let's be perfectly honest. Terry Funk, super adaptable. Super likable. Apparently, according to people that met him, numerous fans, one of the nicest goddamn wrestlers, super gracious, and even though in the latter in the latter years of his life, he really started to break down, how could he not? He had bad knees from the 70s on and kept wrestling, and in his WCW run, well, the best one with Ric Flair, he was in his mid-40s, breaking down, and still kept going because he just didn't give a shit. He wanted to give the fans everything he had and then some. He influenced Mick Foley and so many others, some that used his teachings for the better, and some that only saw the surface of what he did as far as hardcore stuff. But man, what a career, what a life, what everything. There will never be another Terry Funk. The one thing you can say about Terry Funk, I mean, among the list of things, if he wasn't in wrestling, if he never got involved in wrestling, wrestling would be drastically different. There wouldn't be nearly as many memorable moments, matches, feuds. We never really got to see him versus Steve Austin in 97. I will never understand. I will never understand how Vince McMahon could not have capitalized and put that on a marquee pay-per-view. You could have argued that could have main event of WrestleMania 13. Thankfully, we got Austin versus Bret. And the reason I have the Bret Hart t-shirt on is because of the Amarillo Terry Funk WrestleFest 1997 September event where Terry wrestled then WWF champion Bret Hart. And getting ahead of myself with just so many moments, so many promos across multiple countries, across multiple promotions, decades. He could be serious and goofy, but you fucking believed him. So yeah, Terry Funk was born on June 30th, 1944 in Hammond, Indiana. To Dory Funk Sr. and then Dory Funk Jr. I believe. I got to be perfectly honest. I actually thought Dory Funk Jr. had passed away. I'm glad to report that I was wrong. He's a couple years older than Terry, still going strong. And Dory Funk Jr., I mean, super influential as well, still teaching students, still doing great things. No doubt Terry and Dory Jr. were influenced by their dad. Dory Funk Sr., who I wish the film existed of Dory Funk Sr. I would have loved to have seen even just clips, even just brief glimpses of what Dory Funk Sr.'s wrestling would have been like. But so powerful and influential. Amarillo, Texas. Look at a map of Texas. And I don't know a bunch about Amarillo wrestling. If you check out the, it's either Tim Hornbaker, Scott Teal. I'm trying to remember other wrestling historians that would have done stuff on Amarillo. Crowbar Press or stuff like that. And no, this is not, a cheap plug or anything that I was asked to say. I'm just remembering stuff that I've seen and stuff from Cornette's podcast and Cornette. There's going to be stories about Cornette in this because Cornette and Funk inextricably linked as far as their time in Smoky Mountain Wrestling and just the time in Memphis and stuff like that. But looking at what Terry meant to wrestling. I mean, getting started in 1965, December 9th, 1965, his debut. And starting for the Western States sports promotion. I mean, I believe he was at West Texas State. He played football. I don't remember what position he played. I know he has a biography out that I probably need to check out at some point. Either get it on audiobook or get the paperback copy, the hardback, whatever. Teaming with Dory Jr., you want to talk about one of the greatest tag teams of all time. That would be on the Mount Rushmore of tag teams. Now, there's not as much footage of them in Amarillo, if any at all. You can see still pictures. You can see that even though Amarillo, 150, 200,000 people maybe, in that whole territory, they would run New Mexico, they would run other Odessa, and they would run other, towns like that. And they would just, they would draw good sized crowds, and it wasn't a huge territory, but it was something that Dory Funk Sr. had so much influence in the NWA. That's how Dory Jr. was able to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship from Gene Knitsky and hold it for about 4 years, I believe, if I recall correctly, or close to it. And Dory Funk Jr., after winning that, after holding it for a while and everything, and then dropping it to Harley Race, he dropped it to Harley Race, and Harley Race, of course, one of the greatest of all time. I mean, it would be impossible to encapsulate Harley Race's career, but he meant so much in the NWA. I could only. God, I wish. I mean, obviously, there was no way to be there. I mean, that match happened 8 years before I was born. I would have loved to have been there just to see that. What an atmosphere that match must have created. But Harley Race was there. Jack Briscoe had won the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, and Terry Funk kept rising up in the ranks. He was making his appearances. He was wrestling in championship wrestling from Florida. I do wish that more Florida footage was put on the network by WWE, considering they own the footage. I would love to see that stuff, just to see and hear, rather, Gordon Solie calling it, and just Terry Funk and Dory working his heels, working his faces. He was making his appearances in All Japan Pro Wrestling. Dory Funk Jr. would become the, I believe, the American booker for Giant Baba. Terry Funk was so beloved in Japan, so he's going to all these promotions, going to all these places. On U.S. soil, I believe he's making appearances in Mexico. He was making appearances in Japan. And to think that by the time he won the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, it was about 10 years after his debut, on December 10th, 1975. And he would hold it for about 14, just close to 15 months. And he defended against various people. Giant Baba. He would wrestle various people. He won it from Jack Briscoe. Jack Briscoe, who basically said, "Damn it, I want the title, please, or I want the title off, please." And it was tough. It was a tough schedule. You made a lot of money in the 70s, even at that point. Even though you were traveling more, than in the 50s and 60s and stuff like that, you were wrestling all over the world. The NWA governing body, even though there were various promotions, AWA, WWF, there was a CWA. Continental Wrestling Association, there was stuff Nick Goulis, all that. There was all this stuff going on, and Terry Funk, being the, one of, being a pair, part of the brother pair that won World Heavyweight Championships, recognized World Heavyweight Championships, that's a big goddamn deal. And Terry was so good at this point. He was 10 years into his career. He would lose it in February of 77. To Harley Race being the only man to beat two brothers for the World Heavyweight Championship. Great shit. And Harley Race would reign and rule as World Heavyweight Champion. Terry Funk, even though he would not win a recognized world title for a while, and I mean, you could take a look at historical stuff and wiki and everything and see about the various championships he had. Terry was always somebody that people appreciated. his stuff in All Japan, he had fucking record albums. He had record albums. I've heard some of them. Some of the audio has been posted over the years. One thing Terry Funk wasn't was a singer. I mean, he wasn't bad. Wasn't great. His music was certainly an acquired taste. But this is how long Terry Funk had wrestled. He wrestled Jack Briscoe, Giant Baba, which I could only imagine even at that point how those matches with Baba must have gone. Dusty, the egg-sucking dog that he is. Pat O'Connor. That's how long Terry Funk's been wrestling. That Pat O'Connor faced him. So, he's making these appearances in All Japan. Still wrestling in Florida. I mean, he wrestled in Florida, I think, until the early 80s. Amarillo, after Dory Funk Sr. had passed away, started to really not go all that well because Dory Jr. at first was traveling. Because Dory Funk Sr. died in 71 or 73. It was around that time. Dory Funk Jr. lost the championship in May of 73. And Terry won it in 75. So Amarillo kind of went by the wayside, like a lot of territories. Cable television was changing, but Terry always kept evolving. Into his late 30s, he was feuding with Jerry Lawler. With great promos and great stuff. Just, you would believe it with Terry Funk that he was just that nuts, just that insane. The empty arena match in April of 1981, the whole thing where he, the chair that went to the eye, my eye, you got my eye, and you can't help but do a Terry Funk impression, but just Terry so gifted, and he still kept doing, like, he still kept going over to Japan, and you could understand why Baba would appreciate the Funks, their respect for wrestling. Baba was more of an Americanized version of, or an Americanized version of Japanese wrestling, I guess would be the best way to describe it, even though New Japan had some really good styles as well. But he would still make appearances in Japan, but by the early 90s, things were starting to go a little bit south, as it were, because Baba was moving further down the card. Funk was getting older. I mean, good God, like, by the time he got to... By the time he got to ECW, he was approaching 50. So, during this time, Terry's continuing to do stuff, continuing to do great things, work hard, he would work smarter and also harder. It's kind of funny, he would take those wild bumps, like he would take the bump where you get caught in the ropes and he'd just do the bounce and stuff like that. It's kind of like how, John Moxley, when he was Dean Ambrose, would try to do the rebound clothesline. And other people would try to duplicate that stuff. And some people did it okay, but Terry Funk, truly one of a kind. The stuff in Memphis. Cornette talked about how at one point, Terry would chase him when he was a photographer. I think he ripped his pants down when he was a manager. He would do all this great stuff. And 20 years into his career, I mean, so we're talking like 1985, he finally joins the WWF. But before we even get to that, he had bad knees. He was 41 when he went to the WWF. And he kept going. He influenced so many people. I mean, Mick Foley talks about how Terry Funk was his idol. Tommy Dreamer. I mean, you could see that Tommy Dreamer respected and loved Terry Funk. I mean, there was the stuff on Barely Legal, 1997, that I'll get to here in a bit or in the next video. And the stuff that Terry Funk was able to do to continue to reinvent himself and how much he loved wrestling and wanted to pass on knowledge to the next people. He knew he could make people by, beating them and also, doing business properly with them. And he could always keep his heat, as it were, by just working hard and doing great, incredible work, regardless of who he was working with. There are people that Terry Funk had great matches with that had no business being in the ring with him at that point. And that's not saying that they were bad people, but they were so beaten down, beaten up, or on various substances, talk about here in a bit, where he got great stuff out of them, or at least as much good stuff out of them as he could. His promo style being serious and everything, I mean, you just look at the stuff that he would do in Mid-Atlantic, the stuff that he would do... I could only imagine how the promos, came across in Japan. But Terry and Dory continuing to team up. They were heels at first, and then they were beloved. People were just, glomming Terry Funk. when he would try to get in the ring, seeing some of that footage, him versus Brody, Stan Hansen, teaming up with Dory Funk Jr., and he makes his WWF debut in June of 1985. So right around his 41st birthday. So still, all that time, former NWA champion, started in Amarillo, Texas, 1965, traveling all over the world, doing that stuff in Japan. And then he beats up an enhancement talent, I don't remember the guy's name, and then attacks Mel Phillips. Read up on Mel Phillips, folks. Ring announcer, WWF ring announcer Mel Phillips. You will want to scour yourself with about 5 Brillo pads after you read up about that creep and the fact that Linda McMahon brought him back and everything and all that, even though you could have gotten rid of him and you could have taken care of him in, almost a hit style, and you wouldn't have, found that he was missed by anybody. But Terry Funk should have brutalized the guy. I mean, he terrorized him. That was good. And he had the branding iron thing, he had the cowboy hat, all that, but, should have branded Mel Phillips and beat the... Anyway, trying not to get banned here. Terry Funk, though, wrestled Junkyard Dog. And Junkyard Dog at that point was about a year into his run in WWF, and if we're being quite honest, Junkyard Dog, and this was talked about, he was not doing all that well. Substance abuse issues and all that. He was having some issues. But Terry Funk could get the most out of somebody even at that point in their career, life, condition, whatever it were. As long as you shut up and listen, you would be able to have a great match with Terry Funk. And he then even had his partner Hoss Funk. They named Dory Jr. Hoss. I'm not saying that Dory Jr. was not legit tough and was not somebody they couldn't stretch. You probably still could now when he's in his early 80s at least. He's a couple years older than Terry. 3-4 years older or something like that, but still could probably fucking stretch you. And apparently Dory Jr., really, really nice guy. So, the fact that Terry only had one Mania appearance in the 80s is criminal. During the heyday of Mania, it was teaming up with Hoss Funk against Tito Santana and JYD. So there we are. And he would even have a run with Hogan. That must have been just a thrill for Terry. Which Terry, by talking about, ha 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 ha, no, I mean for Hogan. And Terry Funk at this point is 21 years into his career, almost. Or, well, yeah, about 20, because we're approaching the end of 86. So it'd be about 21 years. And he's continuing to wrestle, he's doing all this stuff, but the WWF schedule was a fucking grind. And if I remember right, he had a divorce from his first wife, and then they got remarried at some point. Unfortunately, Vicky, I think was her name, she passed away in 2019. Very, very tragic. They obviously loved each other. I mean, if you're going to get divorced but remarry the person, obviously it is meant to be. So after the Mania 2 match, he wrestles against Hogan, and then they even had Jimmy Jack Funk, who was Jesse Barr, as a gimmick Funk brother. And then he basically mentions, well, Vince, my horse is sick. I gotta go home. Terry. The horse is sick. I don't blame him. Vince didn't get Terry. Looking back at that TV, looking back at that stuff, Vince did not get Terry Funk. Terry Funk needed to be the wild, crazy guy, and even though he didn't need to bleed in all the matches to get people's attention, you don't need to bleed in every match, Mox. But Terry made things count and told stuff through Impact and would do great, wild, crazy brawls. And being managed by Jimmy Hart didn't hurt, because even though Terry Funk was a great talker, Jimmy Hart could just be the kind where you just heap the heat on everybody. And Jimmy Hart, Mount Rushmore, favorite managers of all time. I mean, easily. 100% easily. Heenan, Hart, Cornette, I don't know, somebody else on there. That being said, Terry did decide to leave the WWF. I don't blame him necessarily. He was there for about 10 months. And I imagine it was pretty damn good money. because Terry was still making great money bouncing around to various promotions, and he continued his time in Japan. Still super over, wrestling various talents and everything, and this is his time in All Japan, by the way. We'll get to the deathmatch stuff here later. But the main crux of why I wanted to do possibly a two-parter was to talk about his time in WCW against Ric Flair. Because we're going to start talking about that, and I just recently watched the Wrestle War 89 Aftermath, where he faced off again, where he was like, hey, Rick, I'd love to challenge you for a match or whatever, for a World Heavyweight title match. And he was one of the judges at Wrestle War 89 if the match with Flair versus Steamboat went the distance. Lou Thesz was also one of the judges. And he said, well, Terry, you've been spending too much time in Hollywood, hanging out with Sylvester Stallone and all that, and there's a top 10 contenders thing, and the champion has to face all those guys and everything, and Funk's like, oh, you don't think that I'm worth it, huh? Well, I'm not saying that, Terry, but you've been spending a lot of time in Hollywood. And there was a Western show called Wild Side that I had totally forgotten about that only had like 6 to 8 episodes or something like that. He was an over-the-top Hawk! There's a deep cut for MST3K fans. Paradise Alley, The Ringer, and Roadhouse. Roadhouse. He did choreography for a fight in Rocky V. And he was well respected. Sylvester Stallone, I believe, was... Terry Funk had told Cornette and other people this when he was on one of the set. I think it was Paradise Alley that some of the people were knocking wrestling, and Stallone said, those guys do all their shit in one take in front of a live audience, and you shut the fuck up and show respect. And even though Sylvester Stallone has proven that he probably has suffered a little bit of CTE and has questionable views, got to respect that for the fact that he likes, or that he respects professional wrestling that much. So he had, I believe, 3 albums, I believe is what's listed. Great Texan was one that was released in 1984. But the whole point about Great American Bash 1989 is how we got there, Wrestle War 89. When Flair refused that, he's like, I was just kidding. I was just joshing you. I didn't want a title shot. I just want... And Jim Ross is standing there, and Jim Ross made this, because Flair had wrestled Steamboat in an incredible 23, 25-minute match. Ricky had Bonnie with him, that trash heap, that stupid twat. Doesn't deserve a day of happiness in her life for what she did to Ricky. But, so Flair had done all this stuff, and then Terry clocks him and just beats him up and throws him out and gets on the ringside table and does not a tombstone, but does a pile driver. And the way they do the pile driver, it just looks like, oh, Rick's head jams and everything. Rick sells that. Terry's throwing the table. He's trying to get the table up. Blair, the table is not cooperating because furniture doesn't cooperate. He does that and hits Flair in the head with a chair. Just, boom. Really great shit. And Flair's selling like he's goddamn beat up to beat the shit and all that. And it was just great. It was just great goddamn shit. The pile driver was great. Rick was selling it. Neck injury. He might possibly have to retire. This is one of the few good things that happened during the Jim Herd run in WCW. And there weren't a lot of things despite the great talent. But we go to Great American Bash 1989. Huge house for the Great American Bash 1989 pay-per-view. Unfortunately, the tour itself, things had really fallen off. There were I think 3 halfway decent shows as far as crowds, according to Cornette, who was on the thing and talked about it on his podcast. But Flair versus Funk. And they had already had a pretty decent card. Great American Bash 89, even though there were issues, still one of the greatest NWA WCW pay-per-views ever, I would argue, for this match in general. But there was Steamboat versus Luger. There was, I believe, the crowd was absolutely cheering the living fuck out of Sid. How could you not look at Sid? Nut job, even though he had half the brain that we do. That's a quote from him. You're half the man I am, and I have half the brain that you do. Good word, Sid. Terry Funk, though, and Ric Flair. Hard-hitting, personal, just watch the match. Fucking incredible. There was one point where, and it's a few minutes into the match, but Terry's just laying these overhead chops and everything, and Flair hits this chop. Not only does it sound like a rifle shot, Terry sold it, and you could tell it hurt. As tough as Terry is, and as much as Rick had that range and would take care of people, he would throw those chops. And Terry, you could tell because he's stiffening up, and he's like, all this. And did it well. See, he could do the stumbles, a drunk stumble to stiffen up. He could do that, and he could make it work. He could make it work because he was Terry goddamn Funk. And then, Flair manages to beat him, even though Terry used a branding iron, all that great stuff. And then Great Muta, who had wrestled Sting, and they had fought over the TV championship, came out and misted Flair. Sting came out, big old frack, da-da-da-da-da-da. And Flair vowed revenge. They would continue to do stuff, on TV and stuff like that, including the plastic bag incident, where TBS executives didn't want that. People might try that stuff at home. Kids might try that at home. TBS bans gratuitous violence on a show about gratuitous violence, I believe was the memo. Good old Cornette stuff there. And then the I Quit match at Clash 9. And that was great stuff. But one match I think that gets forgotten about during this whole run. Let's go back a little bit. Halloween Havoc 1989. Was it Thunderdome or Thunder Kids? I think it was Thunderdome. This is Thunderdome. Not the award-winning WWE Thunderdome. It's Terry Funk and Great Muta against Flair and Sting. Gimmicked up cage. There's jungle stuff up on the thing, and fire started. A twisted fire started. Hey, hey, hey. And Muta's like, oh, nobody can put this up. Get up. Boom, boom. Just hits the mist a couple times. Yeah, I can't imagine why Muta was getting cheered doing cool shit like that. Muta and Funk were a great team, by the way. But there were the designated Terminators, Gary Hart, Ole Anderson for the respective face heel sides, and Terry Funk was in that. And then they went to the final blow-off, which was an I Quit match a few weeks later. I think it was mid-November. And Funk and Flair had another classic, as you would expect. And then Terry's like, yes, I quit. And Gary Hart was pissed, all that. Well, that was a way to write Terry Funk off and have him retire. Now, he had already, I think, retired in 83, 84, but then kept wrestling because Terry Funk has retired plenty of goddamn times. But did the I Quit match, did all that, and then would show up sporadically in WCW. He stuck around to 1999, I think, or 1990. Had a thing called Funk's Grill, which was a talking segment. Left for the USWA. He returned to WCW in 1994. Slamboree match versus Tully. I actually did recently retro review that, I believe. The War Games match in 1994, joined the Stud Stable. Dusty Rhodes, the egg-sucking dog that he was. And then from there, he would have his time in FMW. Onita would pay him well, probably not as well as Terry Funk deserved, because Onita was a bit of a greedy bastard, as it were. But no doubt, since Onita and Terry had such a long-standing relationship as far as working, Onita was a young boy, came over and worked in Amarillo and stuff like that, or worked with Terry Funk, that is. And Terry helped him get booked, and there was a long-standing respect, so naturally Terry would come over for a sizable amount of money, but again, probably not as much as he deserved with the stadium, Kawasaki Stadium shows and other big stadium shows, and just in general a lot of great crowds. Terry Funk and Onita had some classics, and you could look that stuff up on YouTube. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert there, but let's just say the Time Bomb death match, Exploding Ring death match, or whatever it was done a lot better by Onita, not so much in other companies. But then, from there we get to his ECW run. That's actually where I'm going to end it here. So I'm going to talk about his ECW run, stuff through the indies and everything in part 2. Let me know your thoughts on, his runs up to ECW in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, Twitter handle in the description. And that's all I really have to say right there. So yeah, wait for part 2. But Terry Funk, hell of a goddamn career so far, and more to come.